Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
Millions watched it live, expecting to witness history. A teacher in space, a nation inspired. But in just 73 seconds, a dream shattered before the world's eyes. What if the truth is even more haunting than you ever imagined? What if warnings were ignored, lives could have been saved, and new evidence lies hidden beneath the waves? This isn't just a story about a rocket. It's a story about choices, silence, and the terrible price of looking the other way. Let's uncover the untold truth of the Challenger disaster. Millions of Americans gathered around their television sets on the morning of January 28, 1986. Schools paused their lessons, families huddled together, news anchors spoke in excited tones about a moment that was supposed to make history. This wasn't just any space mission. This was the first time a civilian, a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe, would journey into space. It was meant to be a symbol of hope, a promise that the stars were within reach of ordinary people. The Challenger launch was more than a scientific event. It was a national celebration. On playgrounds, in classrooms, and in living rooms across the country, children and parents alike watched the countdown. 10, 9, 8. The engines ignited with a roar, sending a brilliant plume of fire and smoke into the clear blue Florida sky. Cheers erupted, hands clapped. The nation held its breath as Challenger climbed steadily upward, leaving behind a trail of white against the heavens. But just 73 seconds after liftoff, everything changed. What viewers saw next would haunt a generation. A fireball. A strange branching cloud that no one immediately understood. Confusion swept over the crowd at Cape Canaveral. Teachers and students stared at the screen in disbelief. On live television, what had begun as a moment of triumph became an unfolding tragedy. The Challenger was gone. What most people didn't know then, and what many still don't realize, is that the disaster didn't play out the way we imagine. The crew didn't perish instantly in an explosion. The shuttle didn't simply blow up as headlines would later claim. What happened in those 73 seconds and in the silent, terrifying moments that followed was far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more avoidable. What if I told you that at least some of the astronauts were alive as they fell toward the Atlantic Ocean? What if the night before the launch engineers pleaded with NASA to stop, warning that disaster was inevitable, and NASA chose to proceed anyway? What if nearly 40 years later, a piece of Challenger was discovered on the ocean floor, reigniting questions that had never truly been answered? This isn't just a story about a rocket. It's a story about ambition, politics, silence, and the devastating price of ignoring warnings. In the minutes after the breakup, as fragments of the shuttle rained into the sea, NASA scrambled for answers. Mission control went silent. Viewers at home were left bewildered. A voice finally crackled over the broadcast flight, "We have a major malfunction." But what led to that moment, what decisions, compromises, and overlooked warnings paved the way to tragedy? And why, after decades, does the Challenger disaster still hold a mirror to the dangers of overconfidence and the cost of failing to listen? In this investigation, we'll uncover the untold truth of the Challenger disaster, the hidden warnings, the cultural failures, the final moments of the crew, and the discoveries that continue to emerge. This is the story of how a dream of routine spaceflight became a cautionary tale that echoes through history. Let's go back to where it began. The Challenger shuttle wasn't born out of reckless ambition. It was born out of necessity, a desperate bid to keep NASA relevant in a world that had already celebrated mankind's greatest space triumph. When Apollo 11 touched down on the moon in 1969, it marked the height of American technological achievement. But after Apollo 17 returned home in 1972, NASA faced an uncertain future. The moon had been conquered, the race had been won, and the American public, along with Congress, began to look elsewhere. What's next? That was the question NASA had to answer fast. The space agency was no longer the darling of unlimited budgets and unquestioned support. The Cold War still raged, and spending priorities shifted toward defense domestic issues and new technologies. Funding for space exploration shrank. The glory days were over. In response, NASA proposed a bold new vision, a reusable space vehicle capable of flying missions routinely and affordably. The Space Shuttle program, officially called the Space Transportation System, was designed to be the future of spaceflight. It wouldn't just carry astronauts, it would ferry satellites, science experiments, and military payloads into orbit. It would make space travel look as simple as commercial aviation. But behind that inspiring vision lurked harsh realities. To secure political approval and the necessary funding, NASA promised more than it could safely deliver. It committed to launching the shuttle as often as 24 times a year, an impossible pace given the complexity and maintenance needs of each vehicle. And in doing so, it locked itself into a schedule that would later prove deadly. The shuttle was sold to Congress and the public as a workhorse, a space truck, that would open the heavens to science industry and national defense. But funding shortfalls forced dangerous compromises. The original design, safer, more robust, more flexible, was deemed too expensive. NASA had to cut corners. One of the most fateful decisions involved the choice of solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. Liquid-fueled boosters were safer. They could be shut down in an emergency, but they were more expensive, and they required more time to develop. Instead, NASA selected solid rocket boosters manufactured by Morton Thiokol, a contractor with strong political connections. Solid boosters are simpler to build and store. But once ignited, they cannot be turned off. They burn until the fuel is gone. There is no abort, no shutdown. From ignition to burnout, the crew is committed. Worse still, the boosters were built in segments bolted together with field joints sealed by rubber O-rings. This segmented design made transportation and manufacturing easier, but introduced a critical vulnerability. If the O-rings failed to seal completely, particularly in cold temperatures, superheated gases could escape and burn through the booster casing. Engineers at Morton Thiokol raised these concerns as early as 1981. But NASA, eager to maintain its flight schedule and political support, treated these warnings as acceptable risks. The shuttle program wasn't just a scientific endeavor, it was also a symbol of American technological superiority during the Cold War. The Department of Defense had plans for the shuttle to launch spy satellites and secret payloads. Political leaders saw it as a way to showcase American power and progress. NASA, caught between science, military demands, and public relations, had to deliver again and again whether the system was ready or not. By the time Challenger prepared for its 10th flight, the shuttle program had settled into a dangerous rhythm. Each successful mission reinforced a false sense of security. Near misses were reframed as proof of resilience rather than warnings of disaster to come. A culture of overconfidence shaped by political pressure and a desperate need to keep the program alive made the unthinkable inevitable. And so when the morning of January 28, 1986 dawned cold and clear, Challenger stood ready on the pad, a sleek marvel of engineering on the outside, concealing fragile compromises within. A nation watched. But few understood just how much was riding on luck that day, and how thin the line was between triumph and tragedy. The Challenger's final flight wasn't just a mission, it was a promise made to the American people. A promise that space was no longer the domain of elite test pilots and engineers, but of everyday citizens with dreams as vast as the sky itself. That promise was embodied by the 7 astronauts who climbed aboard that morning, each of them a symbol of courage, dedication, and hope. Commander Francis Dick Scobie, a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and a skilled pilot, Scobie was known for his calm demeanor and steady hand. He had flown in space before and understood the risks, but he believed deeply in the mission. To his crew, Scobie was more than a leader. He was a mentor and a friend, someone who inspired confidence even in the most trying moments. Pilot Michael J. Smith. A decorated Navy officer, Smith was on his first space flight. Colleagues described him as sharp, thoughtful, and quick-witted. He was the man responsible for many of the critical systems during launch and ascent, a role that would place him at the center of the crew's final moments. Mission Specialists. Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair. Onizuka was the first Asian American in space, a trailblazer who had already flown once before. His quiet strength and dedication were admired throughout NASA. Resnick, an engineer with a brilliant mind and a passion for music, had broken barriers as one of the first American women in space. Her laughter filled the crew quarters, a reminder that even in high-stakes missions, humanity shone through. McNair, a physicist and talented jazz saxophonist, was beloved for his warmth and determination. His path from small-town South Carolina to the stars inspired countless Americans. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was an engineer representing Hughes Aircraft tasked with satellite experiments. It was his first flight, one he had dreamed of for years. Soft-spoken and diligent Jarvis approached the mission with quiet pride. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space. And then there was Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. Her mission was to make space accessible, to inspire students with lessons broadcast live from orbit. Her smile, her energy, her belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, McAuliffe became the heart of the mission. For millions of school children watching that day, she was the reason they tuned in. Beyond the crew, other key figures shaped the Challenger's fate. Roger Boyce-Joly, a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol. Boyce-Joly had been raising alarms about the shuttle's O-ring seals for years. He saw patterns others dismissed: erosion, blow-by signs of failure waiting to happen. In the days and hours before launch, his voice grew louder. But in a system where deadlines mattered more than details, his warnings went unheeded. Alan McDonald, a manager at Morton Thiokol. McDonald stood beside Boyce-Joly in the final fateful meetings. When NASA pressured Thiokol to greenlight the launch, McDonald refused to sign the authorization. It was a courageous stand, but one that came too late to change the course of history. William R. Lucas, director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Lucas oversaw the shuttle's booster program. His tenure was marked by a culture of control where dissent was discouraged and bad news rarely made it to the top. Lucas became in many ways the face of the system's failure to listen. These were the people behind the headlines. Heroes, engineers, leaders, each caught in a chain of decisions, compromises, and pressures that would converge in a single devastating moment. As the countdown ticked closer, they embodied the hopes of a nation. But they also carried the weight of a system that had stopped hearing its own warnings. The Challenger disaster didn't begin with the roar of engines or the flash of flame in the sky. It began long before, in meeting rooms, memos, and conference calls, where safety and schedule collided, and schedule won. The heart of the conflict lay in the shuttle's design and the promises NASA had made. The shuttle was sold to Congress as a workhorse, a vehicle that could fly frequently, affordably, and reliably. 24 launches a year, that was the pledge. But to meet that impossible pace, compromises were inevitable. And with every successful flight, NASA's confidence in its fragile system grew, blinding it to the risks that accumulated with each launch. One of those risks was the O-ring, a simple rubber seal designed to prevent superheated gases from leaking through the joints of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. From the very first flights, engineers at Morton Thiokol noticed troubling signs: black soot, scorch marks, erosion on the O-rings. Each time the booster had survived, and each time NASA and its contractors convinced themselves the problem wasn't critical. They called it an anomaly, not a failure. They normalized the deviance. Roger Boisjoly saw it differently. To Boisjoly, these weren't anomalies. They were warnings, urgent messages written in soot and burned rubber. He documented his concerns in detailed memos, modeled the risks, and spoke up in meetings. His conclusion was clear: the O-rings were vulnerable, and cold weather made them even more so. At lower temperatures, the rubber lost its flexibility, delaying the seal when the booster ignited. A delay of even a fraction of a second could be fatal. As the launch of Challenger approached, forecasts predicted one of the coldest mornings in Cape Canaveral's history. Temperatures would dip below, freezing a condition the O-rings had never faced. Boisjoly and his colleagues at Morton Thiokol sounded the alarm louder than ever. They urged NASA to delay the launch. They presented data charts and past flight evidence. Their message was unambiguous. The risk was too great. But NASA wasn't listening. Managers under pressure to stick to schedule pushed back. They asked for proof not just of risk, but of certain failure. Show us the data that guarantees the O-rings will fail, they demanded. Of course, such data didn't exist. The only proof would come in the form of a disaster. Morton Thiokol's management, caught between its engineers and its client, faltered. In a now infamous conference call on the night before the launch, they initially supported the engineers' recommendation to delay. But as NASA questioned their stance and the pressure mounted, Thiokol's senior executives changed course. They told their engineers to put on their management hats and approve the launch. Alan MacDonald, present on the call, refused to sign the authorization. But his refusal wasn't enough to stop the machine that had been set in motion. Meanwhile, political pressure loomed in the background. Though no written order has ever surfaced, many insiders believed that NASA managers feared the optics of another delay. President Ronald Reagan was preparing for his State of the Union address. A teacher in space would have been a powerful image, a symbol of American exceptionalism during the Cold War. Challenger's success was more than a technical milestone. It was a political opportunity. In those final hours before launch, the true conflict became clear. This wasn't just a battle between engineers and managers. It was a clash between two cultures, one that valued caution data and integrity, and another that prioritized image schedule and momentum. The engineers warned. The managers chose to roll the dice. When Challenger lifted off that frigid morning, it carried with it more than 7 astronauts. It carried the weight of every ignored memo, every dismissed concern, and every compromise that had been made in the name of progress. The morning of January 28, 1986, dawned clear and cold at Cape Canaveral. The air felt sharp, the temperature hovering at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. Ice had formed on parts of the launch pad overnight, a sight that should have given everyone pause. But inside Mission Control, the countdown continued. The pressure to launch was immense, the window for delay vanishing with each passing minute. At 11:38 a.m., Eastern Time Challenger's engines roared to life. A plume of flame and smoke erupted from the pad as the shuttle lifted into the sky. To the crowd gathered below, including the families of the crew, it was a breathtaking moment. A cheer rose up, mixing with the thunder of the boosters. On television screens across the nation, students watched in awe as Krista McAuliffe's dream of becoming the first teacher in space seemed to come true. But within a second of liftoff, trouble had already begun. Cameras trained on the shuttle captured a small, almost imperceptible puff of gray smoke near the base of the right solid rocket booster. It came from the lower field joint, the very joint that Roger Boisjoly and his colleagues had warned about. The smoke was a sign the primary O-ring had failed to seal as designed. Hot gases were escaping through a gap in the joint. For a few moments, sheer luck kept catastrophe at bay. A small piece of debris, likely charred insulation, or a fragment of the rubber seal itself, became lodged in the gap, temporarily blocking the leak. Engineers later described this as temporary sealing by debris. It was an accidental, fragile fix. The shuttle's fate now rested on a piece of burned scrap. Challenger continued to climb. It passed through Max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, where the forces of speed and air density were at their greatest. The vehicle's structure groaned under the strain, but outwardly all seemed well. Telemetry streamed in. The crew, calm and focused, proceeded with their checklist. Mission Control radioed the call to go at throttle up. Commander Scobie replied, "Roger, go at throttle up." Those were the last words the world would hear from Challenger. At 64 seconds into the flight, disaster resumed its advance. The temporary plug that had sealed the booster joint blew out under pressure. A bright, flickering flame emerged near the aft strut, connecting the right booster to the massive external fuel tank. That flame burned sideways, a blowtorch aimed directly at the shuttle's most vulnerable point, the thin aluminum skin of the hydrogen tank. For several seconds, the flame ate through the tank's structure. The shuttle was now a ticking time bomb. At 73 seconds after launch, the flame pierced the tank completely. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, supercooled and stored under pressure, mixed violently. There was no explosion in the traditional sense, no detonation. Instead, the external tank ruptured, releasing its contents in an uncontrolled, catastrophic burst. The shuttle didn't blow up. It broke apart. The forces of the propellant release combined with the aerodynamic stress tore the vehicle to pieces. The nose cone, crew cabin, and tail separated. The two solid rocket boosters, still burning at full thrust, veered off wildly in opposite directions, their guidance systems shattered. One booster even cartwheeled in mid-air before range safety officers triggered its self-destruct. From the ground it looked like a single explosion, a fireball, a smoke plume, and fragments falling toward the sea. But in reality, Challenger's destruction unfolded over seconds, a grim chain of mechanical failure and structural collapse. Above it all, the crew cabin remained intact, beginning its long, helpless fall toward the Atlantic. What happened in those final minutes would later reveal a deeper, more haunting layer to the tragedy. When the Challenger broke apart at 73 seconds into its flight, it wasn't the end, not for the crew inside the cabin. Unlike the orbiter's wings, tail, and engines, which fragmented almost instantly, the forward crew compartment separated largely intact. It was built to be strong, but strength in that moment was a double-edged sword. The cabin continued along its upward arc for several seconds after the shuttle disintegrated. Then, as gravity overcame its momentum, it began a long, uncontrolled fall from nearly 65,000 feet. For more than 2 minutes it tumbled through the atmosphere, a silent witness to a disaster unfolding before the eyes of the nation. Inside the cabin, 7 astronauts faced the unimaginable. The public watching from the ground or on television believed they had perished instantly. But evidence collected during the investigation would later suggest otherwise. 3 of the 7 personal egress air packs, PEEPs, small emergency devices providing breathable air, had been manually activated. These were not automated systems. Someone had the presence of mind in those chaotic seconds to reach for and turn them on. The air packs weren't designed for survival in space. They offered no pressurization, no protection against the vacuum, but they hinted at something chilling awareness. Even more telling, cockpit switches had been moved from their standard launch positions. These were not the kind of controls that could have been shifted by the violence of the breakup or random forces. They required manual operation. Most experts believe pilot Mike Smith, at least, was trying desperately to regain control or stabilize the cabin during the fall. The cabin itself likely maintained some structural integrity during the descent. The interior may have partially retained pressure, at least initially. But even with oxygen from the PEEPs, the crew had no way to escape, no parachutes, no ejection systems. The shuttle was never designed for a breakup at altitude. There were no options, no procedures for what was happening. For 120 seconds, the crew cabin fell spinning and tumbling powerless toward the ocean below. It was a descent no one could have imagined, no one had planned for, and no one could survive. At impact, the cabin hit the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour, an unsurvivable force that shattered what remained. Mission control went silent in those moments. On the ground, stunned spectators stared at the sky, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Many didn't realize at first that disaster had struck. The unusual smoke plume, the falling debris, it took precious seconds for reality to sink in. Finally, a voice broke through the quiet in mission control flight. "We have a major malfunction." The nation grieved, believing the crew had been lost instantly. But the truth, as revealed in the Rogers Commission report and later investigations, was far more painful. The final moments in the cabin were not a sudden, merciful end, but a desperate fight against the inevitable. A fight fought in silence, hidden from view as the cabin fell from the sky. Those final 2 minutes serve as the haunting heart of the Challenger story. They remind us that this was not just a failure of machinery, but of decisions, human decisions, that left 7 brave souls with no escape. As the debris settled into the sea and recovery operations began, the search for answers was only just starting, and what investigators would find would forever change NASA and the way we think about risk responsibility and the cost of ignoring warnings. In the days that followed the Challenger disaster, the nation mourned. Memorials sprang up across the country. The president addressed the nation, offering words of comfort. But behind the scenes, the work of understanding what had gone wrong began at a furious pace. There were no illusions. This was not an accident that could be written off as bad luck or an unavoidable tragedy. It was a failure, mechanical, procedural, and, above all, human. The Rogers Commission. The White House formed a blue ribbon panel to investigate the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, known simply as the Rogers Commission. Chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, the panel included astronauts, engineers, physicists, and public figures, including Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, and Richard Feynman, the brilliant, outspoken Nobel Prize-winning physicist. The commission's findings were devastating. Yes, the mechanical cause was clear: the failure of the O-ring seals in the right solid rocket booster's field joint. The cold temperatures had stiffened the rubber, preventing it from sealing properly when the booster ignited. Hot gases escaped, burned through the booster casing, and led to the destruction of the external tank. But the commission dug deeper. What they uncovered was a culture at NASA that had over time grown dangerously tolerant of risk. Engineers had raised concerns. Data had shown troubling patterns, but those warnings were reinterpreted, minimized, or ignored in favor of maintaining the flight schedule. The term normalization of deviance became a part of the public conversation, a description of how organizations can begin to see unsafe practices as normal simply because disaster hasn't yet occurred. Richard Feynman's famous demonstration dipping a piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water during a televised hearing made the failure tangible. In that simple act, he showed the American people how fragile the seal had been in the cold conditions of launch day. The commission's report was blunt. The decision to launch the Challenger was flawed. Those who made that decision were unaware of the recent history of problems concerning the O-rings and the joint because of a lack of communication and a failure of management. Consequences and reforms: NASA was ordered to halt shuttle flights until sweeping changes could be made. The booster joints were redesigned. New review processes were put in place to ensure that dissenting voices could be heard and that engineering concerns would no longer be filtered out before reaching decision-makers. Key managers were reassigned or retired. The entire organization underwent a painful period of introspection and change. NASA worked to rebuild not only its shuttle program, but its credibility with the American public. But questions lingered. Even as reforms were implemented, many wondered whether the underlying cultural issues could truly be fixed. Could an agency that had learned to equate risk with routine so easily change its mindset? Could the pressures of politics and budget ever be separated from decisions about safety? The Challenger disaster became a case study not just in engineering failure, but in organizational behavior. Universities, businesses, and government agencies studied it as a cautionary tale. It served as a reminder that technical excellence means little without a culture that supports honesty, accountability, and the courage to speak up. As NASA prepared to return to flight with the Shuttle discovery in 1988, the legacy of Challenger loomed large. Every future mission would be shaped by the hard lessons learned at so terrible a cost. But the memory of those 73 seconds and of the decisions that led to them would never fully fade. The Challenger disaster could have been the final chapter, a closed case of failure, reform, and recovery. But history doesn't let go so easily. Decades after that cold January morning, new discoveries and renewed debates continue to remind us how deeply the tragedy shaped our understanding of risk leadership, and the fragile line between ambition and catastrophe. 2022. A discovery beneath the waves. Off the coast of Florida, a dive team filming a World War II documentary stumbled upon a relic they weren't searching for. Lying beneath layers of sand and seawater, partially buried, was a 20-foot-long section of Challenger's fuselage. The unmistakable thermal tiles still clung to its surface, a silent witness to that day. Nearly 4 decades after the disaster, the ocean had preserved a piece of history no one had been looking for. NASA publicly acknowledged the find and committed to preserving the debris out of respect for the crew and their families. But the discovery reopened old wounds and questions. How much more wreckage remains hidden? Why were some locations kept secret for so long? And what else might we learn from what lies beneath the sea? 2024, honoring a teacher's dream. 2 years after the discovery, a bronze statue of Krista McAuliffe was unveiled in New Hampshire. Captured mid-gesture, smiling, engaging McAuliffe's likeness stands as a symbol not of tragedy but of hope, curiosity, and the power of ordinary people to inspire. Across schools and campuses, her story is taught not just as a feel-good moment about civilian spaceflight, but as a sobering lesson in the price of silence and the responsibility of institutions to protect those they send into harm's way. A death reignites debate. In early 2025, William R. Lucas, the former director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and a central figure during the Challenger era, passed away at the age of 102. His tenure, once celebrated, had long been shadowed by criticism. Under his leadership, engineers were discouraged from raising concerns, and risk became something to be managed rhetorically rather than solved technically. His death brought renewed scrutiny. Could more accountability have prevented the disaster? Did the culture he shaped make tragedy inevitable? The uncomfortable truths that endure. Perhaps the most haunting detail of the Challenger story remains this: the astronauts didn't die in the explosion. At least some were alive, conscious, aware during that final descent. The evidence manually activated air packs moved switches points to those desperate, heartbreaking moments when they fought for survival with no chance of escape. It's a truth not often taught in schools or memorialized in public ceremonies, but it is one we must confront if we hope to truly learn from the past. The lesson that transcends spaceflight Challenger's legacy is bigger than NASA, bigger than space. It's about how organizations make decisions, how cultures form around power and risk, and how easily the normalization of deviance can set in. It's about the cost of failing to listen, of letting ambition eclipse caution. And it's a reminder that success is never an excuse to stop questioning, testing, and speaking up. Looking ahead today as new missions to the Moon and Mars take shape, and as private companies join the race to the stars, Challenger's story remains more relevant than ever. The technology may have changed, but the challenges of culture, communication, and accountability endure. And so we ask, have we truly learned the lessons of Challenger, or are we once again mistaking luck for safety? This is the untold truth of the Challenger disaster, and its echoes will guide every step we take beyond this world.